Dan woke up with a splitting headache. His vision was blurry, his body ached, and the ground beneath him felt hard and cold. As his eyes adjusted, he realized he wasn't on Earth anymore. He lay inside a massive metal cage, the bars stretching high above him like the walls of a prison. Around him, other cages held strange creatures, some reptilian, some covered in thick fur, others with more limbs than he could count. The air smelled of sweat, metal, and something worse, something like blood. Dan pushed himself up, his military instincts kicking in. The last thing he remembered was fighting on the battlefield, dodging explosions and gunfire. Then a bright light, a deafening hum, and darkness. Now he was here, trapped in a place that looked like a nightmare. A deep, guttural voice boomed through the area. "New challengers, welcome to the arena of the Gralax Imperium." Dan turned toward the source of the voice. A towering alien, covered in golden armor, stood on an elevated platform. Its 4 glowing eyes scanned the captives with amusement. "You are now warriors of the Grand Colosseum. You will fight for the glory of the Imperium. You will entertain our people. And if you survive, you will rise." The other captives reacted in different ways. Some growled in defiance, others remained silent, their eyes filled with quiet resignation. Dan clenched his fists. He had heard enough. "I'm not fighting for anyone," he muttered. A nearby alien scoffed. It was a massive, 4-armed beast with dark blue skin and tusks sticking out of its lower jaw. "You don't get a choice, human. You fight, or you die." Before Dan could respond, the gates of the cages creaked open. Large mechanical guards, hulking machines with glowing red eyes, forced them out into an open arena. The crowd above roared, thousands of alien spectators cheering from their seats. The stadium was enormous, its walls lined with weapons and banners of strange symbols. Dan's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a fight. It was a show. From the other side of the arena, a group of elite warriors entered. They were taller, stronger, and armed with weapons that looked far more advanced than anything Dan had seen before. Among them was the biggest warrior of them all, a towering figure standing at least 15 feet tall. Her skin was a deep shade of crimson, her muscular form covered in intricate golden armor. 2 sharp horns curved back from her forehead, and her piercing yellow eyes scanned the arena with a mix of confidence and boredom. When she spoke, her voice was like thunder. "I am Jera, champion of the Colosseum, and I do not waste time on weaklings." The crowd erupted in cheers. The announcer's voice rang out again. "The first challenge. Prove your worth." Dan barely had time to react before the battle began. The warriors attacked, striking down the weaker captives first. He dodged, rolled, and used his agility to avoid being crushed. He had no weapons, no armor, only his wits. Then, a massive shadow loomed over him. Jara. She stared down at him, unimpressed. "You are small." Dan wiped sweat from his brow. "And you are big. We both have eyes." Some of the crowd laughed. Jara didn't. With terrifying speed, she lunged. Dan barely avoided her swing, her fist crashing into the ground where he had stood. The impact sent dust flying. Dan knew he couldn't win in a direct fight, so he did what humans did best. He adapted. He darted around her, staying out of reach. When she lunged again, he sidestepped and kicked the back of her knee. It wasn't enough to hurt her, but it made her stumble. The crowd gasped. No one had made Jara lose balance before. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Then, to Dan's surprise, she laughed. A deep, rumbling laugh. "Interesting," she said. Before Dan could respond, she reached out and grabbed him, lifting him effortlessly into the air. He struggled, but her grip was like iron. She held him up for all to see. "I claim this human," she declared. "He is mine now." The crowd roared with excitement. The announcer confirmed it. "The champion is chosen. The human belongs to Jara." Dan's stomach dropped. Wait, what? Jera smirked. You fight well, little one. You will fight for me now. Dan cursed under his breath. He had just survived his first battle, but now he had a bigger problem. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. Dan sat on the cold stone floor of his new cell, his arms resting on his knees. The arena lights had dimmed, and most of the other captives had been taken elsewhere, probably those who had been claimed by other warriors. He, however, had been marked as Jera's human. He still couldn't believe it. One moment, he had been fighting for survival, and the next, he was held up like some kind of prize. The crowd had cheered, the announcer had declared him hers, and just like that, his life had taken another unexpected turn. A deep sigh escaped his lips. He wasn't some pet. He wasn't going to be anyone's property. Before he could think of a plan, the heavy metal door to his cell groaned open. 2 armored guards stepped inside. Their glowing red eyes locked onto him. "Come," one of them said in a mechanical voice. Dan didn't resist. There was no point in fighting now, not until he knew the layout of this place, not until he had a real chance to escape. He let them lead him through the stone corridors, past other cells filled with alien warriors. Some glared at him, others ignored him completely. Then the doors ahead opened into a massive chamber. The air smelled of burning torches and metal. Weapons of all kinds lined the walls, and in the center of the room stood Jera. She was even taller up close. Her golden armor reflected the flickering light, and her piercing yellow eyes locked onto him the moment he stepped inside. The guards released him and left without a word. Dan crossed his arms. "So what now? You gonna put a leash on me?" Jera smirked. "If I wanted a pet, I would have chosen a Koran beast. You are different." "Yeah. And what does that mean?" She stepped forward, towering over him. "You are not the strongest, not the fastest, but you fight differently, smart. And you made the crowd cheer. That means you are valuable." Dan frowned. "Valuable for what?" "Your amusement." Jera chuckled. "For survival." She turned, grabbing a large wooden staff from the wall, then tossed it toward him. Dan caught it, but the weight nearly made him drop it. She grabbed one for herself, twirling it effortlessly in one hand. "You belong to me now," she said simply. "That means I train you. If you survive, you rise in rank. If you become strong, I become stronger." Dan tightened his grip on the staff. "And if I say no?" Jera's smirk faded. "Then you die in the next fight." Dan exhaled slowly. He hated this, but she was right. If he didn't learn to fight, he wouldn't last long. He had no armor, no weapons, and no allies. His only chance was to play along, at least until he could find a way out. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's get this over with." Jera wasted no time. She lunged forward, swinging the staff in a wide arc. Dan barely managed to dodge, the force of the swing sending a gust of air past his face. She wasn't holding back. Dan steadied himself and countered, striking toward her ribs. She blocked effortlessly, then twisted her weapon, knocking his staff from his hands. Before he could react, she kicked his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain shot up his back. He groaned. "Yeah, okay. That was expected." Jera stepped over him, her smirk returning. "You are slow. Or maybe you're just too big." She raised an eyebrow. "Size means strength." Dan sat up. "No, size means a bigger target." Jera watched him for a moment, then chuckled. "Clever, but words do not win battles." She held out a hand. Dan hesitated, then took it. She pulled him up effortlessly, as if he weighed nothing. "Again," she ordered. And so they trained. For hours, Jera knocked him down, again and again. She was faster than she looked, her strikes powerful and precise. But Dan wasn't useless. He learned. He watched her movements, noted the way she attacked. She fought like a warrior used to overpowering her enemies. But Dan, he fought to survive. By the time the training ended, he was drenched in sweat, his body aching. Jara, on the other hand, didn't look tired at all. "You are not as weak as I thought," she admitted. "Thanks," Dan muttered. "That means so much." She smirked. "Rest. Tomorrow, the real fights begin." Dan didn't like the sound of that, but he had no choice. If he wanted to live, he had to be ready. And if he ever wanted to escape, he had to become stronger. Dan stood in the center of the arena, gripping the wooden staff Jara had given him the night before. The sand beneath his feet was stained from countless battles, and the air buzzed with excitement from the alien crowd watching above. This was his first real fight. Across from him stood his opponent, a four-armed reptilian creature with scales like armor and claws sharp enough to tear through metal. It was twice his size, its glowing yellow eyes locked onto him with hunger. Dan swallowed hard. "Great. They gave me a monster." The announcer's voice boomed through the arena. "The human challenger faces Gorath, the Devourer, a warrior who has slain 50 in the pits. Will the human survive or become his next meal?" The crowd roared. Dan ignored them. He had bigger problems. A horn blared, signaling the start of the match. Gorath charged immediately, moving faster than Dan expected. It swung two of its massive arms, aiming to crush him instantly. Dan rolled to the side, barely dodging as the creature's fists slammed into the sand, leaving deep craters. He had no armor, no brute strength. He had only speed and strategy. Dan circled around, gripping his staff tightly. He remembered Jara's lessons. Don't fight strength with strength. Use weaknesses. Find openings. Gorath roared and swung again. This time, Dan ducked and struck with his staff, hitting the creature's knee. The impact barely did anything, but it made Gorath flinch. That's something. The crowd laughed, entertained by the small human's efforts. Gorath, however, was not amused. It lunged forward, using all four arms to attack at once. Dan barely had time to react. Pain exploded in his side as one of the fists clipped him, sending him tumbling backward. He hit the ground hard, sand filling his mouth. His ribs ached, but he forced himself to move. Gorath stomped toward him. It wasn't just trying to win, it was trying to kill him. Dan's mind raced. He needed an opening, a way to use the creature's own power against it. Then he saw it, the arms. 4 limbs meant more power, but also more weight. And weight meant slower movements. Dan rolled to his feet, gripping the staff with both hands. He let Gorath charge again. This time, he didn't dodge completely. He sidestepped at the last second, letting one of the fists graze past him. But instead of retreating, he lunged forward. Using all his strength, he rammed the staff into the side of Gorath's knee, the same one he had struck earlier. The creature roared in pain, stumbling as its leg buckled. Dan didn't stop. He twisted the staff and jabbed it into the soft spot beneath its jaw. Gorath choked, reeling back. The crowd gasped. Dan didn't give the creature a chance to recover. He rushed forward, and using the staff for leverage, jumped onto Gorath's back. The reptilian beast thrashed, trying to shake him off, but Dan wrapped an arm around its thick neck and squeezed. He remembered an old technique from training. Cut off air, cut off blood, and even the strongest opponent would fall. Gorath thrashed harder, clawing at him, but Dan held on. His muscles burned, his lungs ached, but he didn't let go. Seconds felt like hours. Then, Gorath's movements slowed. Its arms flailed weakly, and finally, it collapsed. The arena went silent. Dan rolled off the creature, gasping for air. His arms trembled, his body screamed in pain, but he was alive. The silence was broken by the loudest cheer he had ever heard. The crowd loved it. The announcer's voice rang through the air. Unbelievable. The human has won. Dan sat in the sand, breathing heavily. He had just beaten a monster. Footsteps approached. He looked up and saw Jara. She stared down at him, expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she smirked. "You fight like a desperate beast," she said. Dan wiped sweat from his forehead. "Yeah, well, desperate beasts survive." Jara nodded approvingly. "Perhaps you are not as weak as I thought." Dan managed to grin. "That means so much." Jara turned to the crowd, raising a fist. "This human is mine. Any who challenge him, challenge me." The crowd roared again. Dan sighed. He had survived, but somehow things had just gotten more complicated. Dan sat on the rough stone bench inside the gladiator barracks, wrapping a cloth around his bruised ribs. His entire body ached from the fight against Goroth, but he was still alive. That was something. The other fighters in the barracks, humans, aliens, and creatures he still didn't understand, stared at him with different expressions, some with curiosity, some with jealousy, others with respect. No one had expected the small, unarmed human to take down a four-armed brute, but he had. The heavy door at the end of the chamber swung open. Jara entered. The moment she stepped inside, the room fell silent. She didn't need to demand attention. Her towering presence did that naturally. She walked straight toward Dan, her golden armor glinting under the dim light. "You fight well," she said. Dan let out a tired breath. "Yeah, I'm feeling it." Jara smirked. "Pain is proof of battle." "Great, I'm full of proof then." She crouched slightly, bringing her gaze level with his. "You did not just win. You made them watch you. That matters." Dan frowned. "Matters for what?" She stood up, looking around the room. "Gladiators fight for survival, but true warriors fight for something more. Honor, strength, power." She turned her gaze back to him. "You have earned your place under me." Dan crossed his arms. "Yeah, about that. What exactly does that mean?" "It means," Jara said, "no one will challenge you without facing me. It means you train with the strongest. And it means you fight by my side in the arena." Dan exhaled. "Sounds like a lot of work." Jara chuckled. "Would you rather die in the dirt, forgotten?" Dan thought about it. He had no allies here, no way home. If he refused, he would just be another nameless fighter in the pits, waiting for the day someone stronger finally killed him. But if he played along, if he learned everything he could, he might just find a way to escape this place. He met her gaze. "Fine, I'll fight." Jara grinned. "Good." She tossed something at him. Dan caught it. A small metal plate with alien symbols carved into it. "That is your mark," Jara said. "It shows you belong to my warband." Dan looked at it, then back at her. "So, what happens now?" Jara stepped back. "Now, you train." The next few days were brutal. Dan had thought his time in the military had prepared him for hardship, but training under Jara was something else. Every morning, she threw him into combat drills. Hand-to-hand, weapons, endurance. She had him spar with warriors twice his size, forcing him to rely on speed and strategy rather than brute strength. When he collapsed from exhaustion, she made him get up. When he made a mistake, she punished it with more drills. But strangely, she never treated him like he was weak. She expected him to fight like any other warrior. And slowly, he improved. One night, after hours of training, Dan sat outside the barracks, staring at the twin moons in the alien sky. His body ached, but his mind was sharp. He was stronger than before. Footsteps approached. Jara sat beside him, arms resting on her knees. "You learn fast." Dan smirked. "Or maybe you're just a good teacher." She chuckled. "Perhaps." For a while, they sat in silence. Then Jara spoke again. "You are not just fighting to survive," she said. "I see it in your eyes. You are waiting." Dan tensed. He didn't answer. Jara turned to him, her golden eyes sharp. "You want to escape." Dan sighed. There was no point in lying. "Yeah, of course I do." She was quiet for a moment. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. "Good," she said. "A warrior with no goal is already dead." Dan looked at her, confused. "You're not going to stop me?" Zara laughed. "No, but if you want to escape, you must be worthy of freedom. Weak men do not leave this place. Only warriors do." Dan thought about her words. She wasn't giving him a way out. She was telling him that if he wanted freedom, he had to take it himself. He looked back at the sky. He still had a long way to go, but he would get there, one way or another. Dan stood in the training yard, gripping a short sword Jera had given him. His muscles ached from the past few days of brutal training, but he was getting stronger, faster. He had to. Every fight in the arena was life or death. If he made a mistake, it wouldn't just cost him a match, it would cost him his life. Jera circled him, holding a long spear in one hand. She was testing him again, watching his movements, studying his reaction time. "You hesitate," she said. "That will get you killed." Dan exhaled sharply. "I'm trying not to. Trying is not enough." She lunged forward, sweeping the spear toward his legs. Dan barely managed to leap back in time, avoiding the strike. Before he could counter, she twisted the weapon and aimed the blunt end at his chest. Dan ducked, rolling to the side and coming up on one knee. He slashed toward her leg, but she stepped back, dodging effortlessly. She was too fast. Dan gritted his teeth. He needed to change his strategy. He couldn't match her strength or speed, but he could outthink her. Jera attacked again, this time stabbing forward with the spear. Instead of dodging, Dan moved toward the attack, stepping inside her reach. The sudden move caught her off guard. He grabbed the shaft of the spear with one hand, locking it in place, then used his sword to strike toward her side. Jera smirked and twisted her body, letting the blade graze against her armor. With one sharp pull, she yanked the spear free and knocked Dan backward with a powerful shove. He hit the ground hard, gasping for breath. Jera walked over, planting the tip of the spear against his chest. "Better, but not good enough." Dan sighed. "You could just say, 'Nice try.'" She chuckled and offered him a hand. "A warrior needs honesty, not kindness." Dan took her hand and stood up, rubbing his sore shoulder. "So, what now?" Zara turned toward the arena in the distance. "Now, you face your next fight." Dan frowned. "Already? I just barely survived the last one." "The crowd wants more," she said. "And so do the arena masters. You are valuable now. They will test you." Dan exhaled slowly. "Who's my opponent this time?" Jara's expression became serious. "A warrior named Kale." The name meant nothing to Dan, but judging by the way the other gladiators nearby stiffened, he knew this wasn't going to be an easy fight. "Let me guess," Dan said. "Big, strong, and wants to kill me." Jara nodded. "But unlike Gorath, Kale is smart. He does not rely only on power. He studies his enemies. He learns their weaknesses." Dan didn't like the sound of that. "Great. So how do I beat him?" Jera smirked. "You do what you always do. You survive." The arena was louder than before. Dan stood in the sand, gripping his sword. Across from him stood Kale. He was human. That surprised Dan. Most of the fighters he had faced so far had been aliens or massive creatures. Kale, however, looked like a seasoned soldier, scared, muscular, and calm. The announcer's voice boomed. "Two humans. One will rise. One will fall. Let the battle begin." The horn blared, and Kale moved instantly. He was fast. Before Dan could react, Kale closed the distance and swung his blade. Dan barely managed to block, but the impact sent a sharp pain through his arms. Kale didn't stop. He attacked again, precise, controlled, relentless. Dan could already tell the difference. Unlike Gorath, who fought with brute strength, Kale fought like a trained warrior. Every move was calculated. Dan dodged a thrust and countered with a quick slash. Cale parried it with ease, then kicked Dan square in the chest. Dan staggered back, gasping. This guy is on a different level. Cale smirked. You're not bad. Dan wiped sweat from his forehead. You say that now. Give me a minute. Cale chuckled. I'll give you less than that. He lunged forward again. Dan knew he couldn't win in a direct clash. He needed to outthink him. He watched Cale's movements carefully, waiting for an opening. Cale struck again, aiming for his side. Dan didn't block. Instead, he twisted his body, letting the blade pass just inches from his ribs. He stepped into Cale's space, using the momentum to slam his elbow into Cale's face. The unexpected move worked. Cale stumbled back, blood trickling from his nose. The crowd gasped. Dan didn't hesitate. He followed up with a quick strike to Cale's leg, forcing him to drop to one knee. But Cale wasn't done. Before Dan could finish him, Cale grabbed a handful of sand and threw it in his eyes. Dan cursed as his vision blurred. Suddenly, he felt the cold edge of a blade against his throat. The crowd roared as Cale stood over him, his sword pressed lightly against Dan's neck. For a moment, there was silence. Then Cale did something unexpected. He lowered his blade. He stepped back and smirked. You learn fast. Dan blinked, still recovering. So, what now? Cale glanced toward the arena masters watching from above. They expected me to kill you, but I think I'll do something worse. Dan frowned. Worse? Cale grinned. I'll make you stronger. And just like that, the fight was over. Dan wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew one thing for certain. His time in the arena was far from finished. Dan sat on the edge of a stone bench in the barracks, rubbing his sore jaw. The fight with Cale had been a wake-up call. He had won against Goreth through strategy, but Cale had completely outmatched him. If Cale had chosen to kill him, Dan would be dead. Instead, Cale had spared him. Not out of mercy, but for something worse. He wanted Dan to learn. Dan exhaled sharply. His time in the arena had been brutal, but now it was about to get even harder. The barracks door creaked open, and Cale stepped inside. Other gladiators turned to look, but no one dared speak. Cale was one of the strongest warriors here. His presence alone demanded respect. He stopped in front of Dan, arms crossed. Get up. Dan sighed. Can I have 5 minutes? Cale smirked. No. Dan groaned but stood. His body still ached from their fight, but he knew there was no point in arguing. Cale nodded. Good. Now follow me. Cale led Dan to a separate training area, an empty courtyard behind the barracks. The ground was rough, covered in sand and stone. There were no weapons here, just empty space. Dan frowned. What is this? Cale turned to him. You rely too much on luck, on others making mistakes. That won't work against real warriors. You need to be better. Dan crossed his arms. And how do I do that? Cale smirked. The hard way. Without warning, Cale attacked. Dan barely had time to react before Cale's fist slammed into his stomach. The air left his lungs, and he doubled over in pain. Cale didn't stop. He grabbed Dan's arm, twisted it behind his back, and threw him to the ground. Dan gasped as he hit the dirt. What the hell? Get up, Cale said. Dan groaned and rolled onto his feet. You could at least warn me next time. Cale shrugged. Your enemies won't. Dan barely had time to process those words before Cale attacked again. This time, Dan was ready. He dodged the first strike, stepping to the side, but Cale was faster. A sharp kick to Dan's leg sent him off balance, and before he could recover, Cale's elbow slammed into his chest, knocking him back to the ground. Dan coughed. I hate you. Cale smirked. Good. Now get up. The training continued for hours. Cale didn't go easy on him. Every time Dan got knocked down, He forced himself to stand. Every mistake he made, Cale punished it with another strike. But slowly, very slowly, Dan started to improve. He learned how to move before an attack came, how to counter, how to use an opponent's strength against them. He was still no match for Cale, but he was getting better. When they finally stopped, Dan collapsed onto the ground, breathing heavily. His arms ached. His ribs felt like they were on fire, but he was still alive. Cale crouched next to him. Not bad. Dan glared at him. I feel terrible. Cale chuckled. That means you're learning. Dan exhaled. So what now? Cale stood up. Now, you eat. Then you rest. And tomorrow, we do it again. Dan groaned. He had a feeling that was going to be the routine for a long time. That night, Dan sat outside the barracks, staring at the sky. The twin moons above cast a soft glow over the arena. Jera walked up beside him, arms crossed. You fought well today. Dan scoffed. I got my face smashed into the dirt all day. Jera smirked. And yet, you are still here. Dan sighed. Barely. Jera studied him for a moment, then sat down beside him. Cale is right. You must be stronger. But strength is not just muscle. It is will. Dan frowned. What do you mean? She looked at him. You could have stayed down. You could have given up. But you didn't. That is what makes a true warrior. Dan chuckled. That or stupidity. Jera grinned. Both are useful in battle. Dan shook his head. He wasn't sure what he was becoming. But one thing was clear. He wasn't the same weak fighter who had entered the arena. And if he kept training like this, maybe, just maybe, he'd have a chance to win his freedom. Dan's body burned with exhaustion. His arms ached, his legs felt heavy, and every breath reminded him of the bruises spreading across his ribs. Yet he kept moving. Cale stood across from him in the training yard, his expression calm as ever. Again, he ordered. Dan clenched his fists and charged. He feinted left, then spun right, aiming a strike at Cale's ribs. It was a smart move, fast and unexpected. But Cale was faster. He sidestepped smoothly and delivered a sharp kick to Dan's side. The impact sent Dan stumbling, but he didn't fall. Not this time. Cale raised an eyebrow. Better. Dan wiped sweat from his forehead. I'd celebrate if I wasn't dying. Cale smirked. You're not dying. You're learning. Dan groaned. He had heard that line too many times. For days now, Cale had pushed him harder than ever. Each time Dan thought he had reached his limit, Cale forced him to go further. The training wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about endurance, about control, about becoming something more than just another gladiator. Dan wasn't sure if he hated Cale or respected him. Maybe both. Cale tossed him a small canteen of water. Tomorrow, you fight again. Dan drank deeply before answering. Who's the opponent? Cale's expression turned serious. Rekar. Dan almost choked on the water. Rekar? As in the Rekar. Cale nodded. Dan had heard the name before. Everyone in the arena knew Rekar. He was a massive reptilian warrior, standing nearly 8 feet tall, covered in thick, armor-like scales. He had won dozens of matches, crushing opponents with sheer strength. Dan exhaled slowly. Great, I just started surviving your training, and now I have to fight a walking tank. Cale leaned against the wall. Rekar is strong, but he's not invincible. He has weaknesses. Dan gave him a doubtful look. Like what? Cale smirked. Figure it out. Dan groaned. He hated when Cale did that. That night, Dan lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. The sounds of the barracks filled the air. Distant voices, the clinking of weapons, the occasional laughter. He wasn't afraid of fighting anymore. He had faced death too many times to fear it. But Rekar wasn't just another opponent. He was a legend in the arena. A shadow moved near his cot. Dan sat up, reaching for the small dagger under his pillow. It was Jera. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You are thinking too much." Dan sighed. "Hard not to think when my next fight might be my last." Jera smirked. "Every fight could be your last. You are still here." Dan shook his head. "Yeah, but Raker is different. He's stronger, faster. If I go head-to-head with him, I lose." Jera nodded. "Yes, if you fight like him, you will lose. But if you fight like you will win." Dan frowned. "And what does that mean?" Jera sat down beside him. "You do not fight with strength. You fight with your mind. You survive because you see things others do not." Dan thought about that. She wasn't wrong. He had never won fights by being the strongest. He had won by being smarter, by outthinking his opponents. Maybe that was his answer. He looked at Jara. "Rakkar has a weakness. I just have to find it." Jara grinned. "Now you are thinking like a warrior." Dan exhaled. Tomorrow, he would step into the arena again. But this time, he wouldn't just be fighting to survive. He would be fighting to win. The arena was louder than ever. Thousands of voices roared as Dan stepped onto the sand, gripping his sword tightly. The air was thick with dust and tension. Across from him, Rakkar stood like a mountain of muscle and scales. His reptilian eyes gleamed under the twin suns, and his massive war axe rested easily in his clawed hands. He didn't look worried. He didn't even look interested. To Rakkar, this was just another fight. To Dan, this was everything. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena. A battle of survival. The challenger, Dan the human, against the undefeated warrior, Rakkar the destroyer. The crowd cheered. Some chanted for Dan, but most screamed for Rakkar. He was a champion, a killer. They wanted to see him crush another opponent. Dan ignored the noise. He had one job: find Rakkar's weakness. The horn blared. The fight began. Rakkar moved first. For such a huge warrior, he was fast. He closed the distance in seconds, swinging his war axe in a brutal arc. Dan barely dodged in time. The blade slammed into the ground where he had been standing, sending sand flying. Dan rolled to the side and slashed at Rakkar's arm, but his sword barely scratched the thick scales. Too tough. Rakkar grinned, showing rows of sharp teeth. Weak. Dan didn't reply. He needed to think. Rakkar attacked again, this time aiming for Dan's legs. Instead of jumping back, Dan moved forward, stepping inside Rakkar's swing. The sudden move caught Rakkar off guard. Dan struck at Rakkar's side, aiming for a gap between the scales. The sword hit, but didn't go deep enough. Rakkar growled and backhanded Dan with terrifying force. Dan flew backward, landing hard in the sand. Pain shot through his ribs. His vision blurred. The crowd roared. They thought it was over. But Dan wasn't done. He forced himself to stand, gripping his sword. He had to find an opening. He watched Rakkar carefully, looking for anything he could use. Then he saw it. Rakkar's movements were powerful, but they had a pattern. His attacks were wide, heavy swings. They were devastating if they hit, but they left him open for just a second after each strike. A small weakness, but it was enough. Dan took a deep breath. If he wanted to win, he had to risk everything. Rakkar charged again. Dan didn't dodge this time. He stood his ground, waiting. Rakkar raised his axe, aiming for a final, crushing blow. Dan moved. At the last second, he rolled forward, slipping under Rakkar's swing. The axe slammed into the sand, kicking up dust. Dan was already behind him. Without hesitation, Dan stabbed his sword into the back of Rakkar's knee, right where the armor was weakest. Rakkar roared in pain as he stumbled, his leg giving out. Dan didn't stop. He jumped onto Rakkar's back and drove his sword toward the gap in his shoulder armor. The blade sank in. Rakkar howled. He tried to throw Dan off, but Dan held on, twisting the sword deeper. The massive warrior dropped to one knee, blood dripping onto the sand. The arena fell silent. Dan panted, still gripping the sword. He had done it. The great Rekar, the undefeated champion, was down. The announcer's voice echoed. Unbelievable. Rekar has fallen. The human wins. The crowd exploded. Some cheered. Some booed. But Dan didn't care. He stepped back, watching as Rekar gasped for breath. The reptilian warrior turned his head slightly, looking at Dan. And then he laughed. A deep, rumbling laugh. You fought well, human, Rekar said, his voice rough but amused. You did not win by strength. You won by thinking. Dan exhaled. It was the only way. Rekar grinned, his sharp teeth gleaming. Perhaps you are worthy of this arena after all. Dan wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a warning, but he knew one thing. He had survived. And in the arena, that was the only thing that mattered. The arena was still shaking from the energy of the crowd. Dan stood in the center, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The sand beneath his feet was stained with Rekar's blood, but the massive warrior was still alive, injured but alive. Dan had done the impossible. He had defeated the undefeated. The announcer's voice echoed across the arena. The human wins. Some cheered, others booed. But one thing was certain. Dan was no longer seen as weak. He turned his gaze toward the high platform where the arena's rulers sat. The alien nobles whispered among themselves, debating his fate. Then the overseer, a tall, gray-skinned alien with piercing golden eyes, stood and raised his hand for silence. The human has proven his strength, the overseer said, and for that, he has earned a choice. Dan stiffened. A choice. You may claim your reward, the overseer continued. Freedom from the arena. A new life beyond these walls. The crowd murmured in surprise. It was rare for a gladiator to be offered freedom. Dan's heart pounded. Freedom. No more fighting, no more blood, no more battles. He could leave, find a way home, or build a new life somewhere in the galaxy. But before he could answer, the overseer spoke again. Or, the alien's golden eyes gleamed. You may stay. You may rise to the rank of champion. Silence fell over the arena. Dan felt his stomach tighten. Champion. That meant more battles, stronger enemies, more danger. He glanced at Kull, who watched from the barracks entrance. The older warrior said nothing, but his gaze was steady. He had trained Dan for this moment. Then Dan looked at Jara, standing with the other fighters. She had always believed in him, even when he doubted himself. And finally, he looked at Rekar. The massive reptilian warrior was still kneeling, blood dripping from his wound, but his sharp eyes were locked onto Dan. There was no anger in them, only respect. Dan clenched his fists. He could walk away, live a quiet life, or he could stay, keep fighting, keep proving that humans weren't weak. He exhaled. And then he turned to the overseer. I stay. The crowd erupted, some in shock, some in excitement. The overseer smiled, clearly pleased. So be it, the overseer declared. From this day forward, Dan the human is no mere gladiator. He is a champion. Rekar chuckled, despite his pain. A bold choice, human. Dan smirked. Wouldn't be fun otherwise. Jara and Kale exchanged knowing looks. They had seen this coming. Dan wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something greater. And the galaxy would never forget his name. The end.